I'm Connor Old and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week we're going to be continuing my list of the top 10 most overlooked / underappreciated movies of the decade. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about a new list of some of my favorite movies of the decade. We break it down by either the top 10 action movies or romance movies, which we've already done. Now, as we're getting into the end part of the series, we're going to be doing some different types like this week, which we're going to be doing the overlooked, underappreciated movies. And essentially, I break down my list in 3 videos. The first video being my picks from 10 to 7 and some 5 honorable mentions. Then my picks from 6 to 2, and finally one video on my favorite, in this case, overlooked / underappreciated movie of the decade, which will be coming out next week. Then the series after that I'm going to be doing is the top 10 foreign films / international films of the decade. So that will be a different kind of a video and explore some different types of movies, which we haven't covered on the show yet. Also, if you want to check out the different movies that I talk about on this list, you can look at the description down below where I give timestamps so you can jump around and check out some of your favorite movies. And please subscribe to the channel and comment below. Let me know some of your favorite movies if you're so inclined to do so. But that's about it. Let's just jump into the episode with my number 6 being Everybody Wants Some.
What am I thinking about?
Baseball. Having a tail.
Cereal? Just thinking about sharks.
Sharks have tails.
It's a good point. It's a good
I
point.
wish I had a tail.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
From legendary director Richard Linklater, which fills the sort of Steven Soderbergh slot that it did on last week's episode, where I chose Steven Soderbergh's Logan Lucky because even though Soderbergh has won an Oscar before, he's been nominated a few times, he's still a filmmaker that didn't really have a lot of respect this decade and made some great movies. And I think a similar situation happened with Richard Linklater, particularly his non-sort of 2000s movies. You know, in this decade he had actually 4 Oscar nominations, so he was actually pretty well liked. And one of his movies, the movie prior to Everybody Wants Some, was Boyhood, which almost won Best Picture and got Linklater his first directing nomination. So but the thing with those, I think, is that Boyhood was a movie that started filming in 2001, but the Before Midnight, which is he got a screenplay nomination, which was a movie that was based on characters from the 2000s. So this is still sort of the 2000s Linklater being recognized now in this decade. But what about his work this decade? I think that something like Bernie in 2011 is a great sort of true crime faux documentary kind of a style with a great and killer Jack Black performance, while also being a really specific and great Texas movie, which of course is really signature to all of Linklater's films. But I also think something like Last Flag Flying is a sort of underappreciated one with its sort of connection to The Last Detail, sort of pseudo connection in that sense. But ultimately I went with Everybody Wants Some because I think that while it did gain some sort of internet buzz at the beginning, it's sort of been forgotten and dropped off, and maybe doesn't even have the sort of strong cult following that we thought it would have when it was initially released. Sort of marketed as a spiritual successor to Linklater's 90s film Dazed and Confused, which followed a bunch of high schoolers around. This movie is set in 3 days following around a baseball team going into college. And the sort of 3 days before school starts. And it's a movie where you watch it on the first time and you're interested in the plot and what's going to happen next and just getting to know these characters. But really the movie succeeds on the 3rd and 4th times, which is sort of a hard ask for a lot of people to say, oh, you have to watch it twice to really gain that appreciation. But I think that the first time you'll enjoy the movie, but that subsequently every time you rewatch it, you'll actually gain more from it. And I think a lot of great movies do this. Some are, say, like Citizen Kane, where every time you rewatch it, you learn something new about the technical aspects or just a different perspective of Charles Foster Kane. But in something like Everybody Wants Some, the rewatches help because you like these characters so much, because you want to see what they're like, you want to go back to your favorite parts and really just hang out with these guys. It's got a terrific young ensemble cast, from Blake Jenner to J. Quinton Johnston. There's just Temple Baker's another. Those are some of my favorites. There's a great cast overall, and I think Linklater, who's always been known as a terrific writer, really shines here because the movie the reason why it holds up to so many rewatches is because you want to hang out with these characters, because you just want to see these sort of situations again and again, the same way maybe certain TV shows like Friends or Seinfeld, you want to watch them because you just like this sort of group of friends. I think similarly here with Everybody Wants Some, and he really nails the sort of team dynamic. Myself being on multiple sports teams throughout my youth, I think that he really nailed these sort of camaraderie between each other, and I think maybe even more specifically, sort of the young male team camaraderie and relationships, how there's sort of the large relationship. There's some seriousness, but there's of course a lot of goofing around, and then also the relationships between each other within them. The dialogue never feels forced or unreal or sort of performative. It always feels like, in a way, they're performative because either they're trying to get girls, they're trying to impress people, but there's always sort of a veneer of sort of truth and honesty towards it, and emotional and genuine moments within the story. But that being said, there's also sort of a romance relationship between Blake Jenner's character and Zoe Deutsch that sort of propels the second half of the film, which I think was a smart choice. The first half is still a lot of fun, and you still get all that baseball hangout stuff in the second half, but because the first half is just so much stuff is going on, it could have easily sort of faded off in that second half. But I think by introducing the romantic relationship, who Zoe Deutsch did an incredible job in another sort of romantic relationship with Glenn Powell, who's also in this movie, but in Set It Up, my top 10 romantic movies of the decade here, she does it with Blake Jenner, and she's also just terrific and genuine and very funny. And I think the movie is paced in such a way that with its sort of signature 3-day structure, just the 3 days counting down until school starts, we get sort of a propelling nature of, there's going to be a party tonight, we're going to try to do something different, we're going to meet somebody, we have practice. There is sort of a structure to the movie that helps propel it, but also through the editing and sort of the rhythm of the movie. It's just sort of a calm, relaxed, easygoing kind of a movie. And I really enjoyed that, and it really helps for those rewatches because you can just wait for that next scene, and then, oh wait, I remember this scene, and there's certain bulk and chunks of the movie really stand out and are memorable because of how it's structured. So by introducing the romance, we also get a different sort of element of the story, that it's not just the hangout, and really adds to just that interest in keeping you engaged throughout the movie. So it has this sort of really great pace, and then the story decisions, whether it be the three-day structure or introducing the romantic relationship, always keeps things fresh, always keeps you on the top of your toes and interested in what's going to happen next. So just incredible writing and dynamic between all the sort of the young players of the baseball team, a good romance in the movie, and just a general ease and laid backness that is cool and calm and just exactly what you almost wished your college experience would have been like, or sort of the idealized version of that it's so easy just to slip right back in to this world and have a great time. So if you're looking for a movie that's just a total blast overall, that I'd recommend pretty much everybody, I think you should definitely check out Everybody Wants Some. Then my number 5 pick is Private Life.
We need to take some responsibility for the situation.
A lot of women have babies at 41. I thought I could too.
You ready? 1, 2, 3.
A Netflix movie that slipped through the cracks despite having a great director and 2 established stars. Netflix is a platform that has really sort of changed the way we look at movies, because so many people, when they think of movies, they think of Netflix. And I think that because of that, they've of course gotten a lot of subscribers, and they're putting a lot of their money into the content. But sometimes that means, movies that are really terrific and get a lot of success. But sometimes a lot of movies can just slip through the cracks. So really how they've been really doing their original movie content, I think, for this later half of this decade, has been the sort of auteur, very Oscar-driven stuff. Think of Roma and The Irishman, which do successful, and then even maybe less successful auteur-driven Oscar pushes, something like 22 July, which didn't get a lot of steam. Then there's some just movies that are maybe genre movies that are made in action or thriller sort of genre types, with something like Extraction or Bird Box, which hits big. And then movies just like A Caliber, which almost made it on this list, which few people have even seen. That's just sort of a great small Netflix thriller that maybe wouldn't have been made had it not been for Netflix. Now I think Private Life sort of fits into the Oscar push, but for some reason or another, it didn't really get a lot of buzz. It only got a couple of awards. Maybe it was the early Sundance premiere, or maybe it just wasn't the right fit. But I think, regardless, Private Life is a really terrific film. The movie is about a middle-aged couple who try to get a baby through any means possible. They try adoption, they try artificial ways, and then ultimately they decide on using their friend's daughter's ovaries as sort of as a surrogate mother, and go through the process with her, which of course causes sort of stress and hilarity and sort of just general drama, we'll say. But the couple is played by Paul Giamatti and Catherine Hahn, who are just two terrific actors who I have been the supporting sort of character actors in so many of their movies and have always been, in a lot of them, my favorite part. You know, and I think just now with someone like Catherine Hahn, for example, is really just getting the chance to show herself as a lead actress and get these lead roles because she's been so funny so many times in these supporting roles that she's finally getting a chance to shine. And that's one of the appeals of Private Life, is that we just don't get enough of Paul Giamatti or Catherine Hahn that often. So when we do see them, it's really refreshing, and we just want to see more of them because they're up to this challenge and they're sort of in a different lane than they have been in some of their supporting roles. And I really like just the concept of this movie because it's a journey I've never really seen before on film or seen in this sort of matter. This sort of strife that's put on the couple and on the relationships trying to get a baby but not being able to do it just the traditional way. So we have this sort of the duality conflicts that the writer-director Tamara Jenkins shows, who, by the way, she's a director unlike someone like Richard Linklater. She only made one movie this decade, you know, so and a great one at that. So I can't wait to see, hopefully she makes more movies in the next decade, in the 2020s, because she's a really great filmmaker. But what she does here is great in terms of the writing and just the directing style, is that when we see the sort of artificial ways and some of the scientific ways, it completely takes the sort of lovingness sort of out of the pregnancy process, that it becomes scientific and cold. And then, but that also sort of contrasted with sort of their more warmer relationship and sort of their cozy New York apartment. But of course, there's just the nature of the concept. There is a lot of strife and hardship that's being put on the relationship because it's an emotional journey, whether it be hormones that are being put on, or just the stress of it all, or just the constant failure. It really does put sort of a stress on the relationship. But I think it's real and written very well because, yes, there's sort of these moments of anger and disappointment, but also there are moments of lovingness, not just bad the entire time, that there is a little bit of different sides, different shades of the relationship, because this is such a long process that they go through. And that, more importantly, I think, in terms of fighting, in terms of drama, it's accurate in terms of the way that really only one character has it at a time. That Catherine Hahn sort of has her moment, and so is Paul Giamatti. And they're, you know, when one is angry, the other one is not, and it's often sort of a small miscommunication or something being blown up on one side, but the other person not meaning it like that. And it just, you know, each person has their little area to be sort of over the top and grand. And I don't want to make this seem that this is sort of a dramatic sort of trying relationship movie, because it is very funny. There's a lot of moments and humor that are being brought to it just by the nature sort of comedic timing and ability and sort of dry sarcasm of something like Paul Giamatti or Catherine Hahn's characters and their comedic abilities, what they bring to that movie is throughout the movie. It is a very funny movie. You know, I don't want to make sort of the reductive argument that it's similar to something like Noah Baumbach in that way, but it's definitely not on the total level of Marriage Story, but maybe a little bit more on the Meyerowitz stories kind of aside. So very funny, but also very dramatic. And Tamara Jenkins, I think, really nails the characters and how they're written in terms of just how they react to one another, in terms of how the relationship are, how arguments kind of work, and just the long sort of journey that I haven't seen before that I thought was refreshing and interesting. So if you want to just check out sort of a great New York movie with two amazing character actors finally becoming leads, you know, I don't really want to say they're character actors, but I just haven't seen them in enough movies, and when we get to see them as leads, they sort of knock it out of the park. So two great performances, real sort of realistic and genuine writing with some great funny moments in a movie you probably haven't seen before. Check out Private Life. Then, with my number 4 pick, I'm going to go with Paterson.
Without love, what reason is there for anything?
He's not gonna do anything crazy.
Everything he does is crazy.
Nobody move!
A bus driver in Paterson.
Aha, what?
This very poetic.
Another movie from an acclaimed director, which will be a common theme as we progress with this list, because for some reason, just because a director's made more than one movie in the decade, I think some people think and sort of disregard some other movies, even though some of them, their movies this decade, were still made with incredible love and care. From independent legend Jim Jarmusch, you know, I think it's easy to look at the new people this decade, whether it be Greta Gerwig or Ari Aster, and be like, oh wow, this is the future, I'm very excited for their new movies, they're fresh and exciting. But then sort of also sort of, it's easy to forget about someone like Jim Jarmusch, who has been making great independent movies since the 80s and has done maybe one of his best movies ever, I think, with Paterson. Now, it's a movie that I really haven't seen before, and it's not a movie that is sort of this unique, mind-bending, super weird, strange kind of movie. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. It's very mundane. It's sort of run-of-the-mill. Nothing necessarily really happens in some ways sort of traditional to Jarmusch's earlier work, something like Stranger Than Paradise, and sort of that theme that he's gone throughout his career, but I think really well perfected here with Paterson, about a bus driver who is also an aspiring, I guess, poet, or he is a poet, who writes poetry really every waking second while he's waiting for his bus, while he's at home, and we just see him sort of his daily life. We see every single day he goes up, wakes up, eats breakfast, goes to the bus station, drives the bus, has lunch, goes home, has a beer, and then, you know, goes to bed eventually. So that sort of mundaneness and sort of repetition is actually the success of the film, and actually what makes it work. And I think that, for me at least, the medium of film is so central to it being a visual medium that the visuals have to stick with you. But also, just as important, I think, is the cut, is the edit. That unlike any medium, whether poetry, art, or music, is that the actual cut, the editing, allows you to change the story and take us in different ways, but also, in this case, I think puts you in a certain mindset, that there's a hypnotic kind of a way of how the sort of movie is structured and how it's paced, that there is similar into the poetry that Adam Driver's character says and explores throughout the movie. The film also has a sort of poetry to it, that there is a sort of rhythm and a pace throughout the movie, that if you're doing poetry, you know, sometimes stanzas repeat, and in this way, his days repeat. His days and his structure and his sort of routine is very similar, but what's interesting is that when it's interjected with a small event, you know, it's small in the grand scale of things, but within the character's life, it's a big deal. Whether he meets another sort of a little girl who's also a poet, or the bus breaks down, you know, it's not a huge deal, but within the constructs of the story, it becomes sort of a narrative driving force. And I think what Jarmusch does here, through the sort of bus driver character, a pursuit and a job that's very lonely and sort of solitary, he sees it as a way to sort of sit back and analyze and sort of decide and decipher human experiences and the day-to-day lives, and actually trying to make that more interesting. That there's one situation where he's overhearing a conversation on a bus about, you know, these young anarchists, or he meets sort of a Japanese man who's in Paterson and has sort of a wonderful exchange with him. That there's these little moments that, you know, the routine's the same. He does the same thing every single day, so that allows for sort of a predictability, a calmness, a routine that's expected. So that when these smaller things happen, it's the only change of the day, so therefore it becomes more interesting. So Jarmusch actually, through his editing pattern and through the story structure, actually develops, without you maybe even realizing it, a sort of natural rhythm, a natural edit, and through that actually makes it very comforting, as how the feeling I experienced when watching the movie, which I've seen a few times now, is that it feels comforting because of the predictability, but then it becomes very much interesting because when something changes, when there's a small little event that changes, you become interested just as much as Paterson, Adam Driver's character, is. Now, there is some sort of odd coincidentals. I mean, you want to talk about poetry and repeating things, how the film edits. I mean, there's also the coincidences or not coincidences, how the main character's name is Paterson, and he's a bus driver in Paterson, New Jersey. I mean, Adam Driver, he's a bus driver. Maybe that's a little one of a stretch, but there is sort of these similarities that occur, or even just his wife, who loves sort of black and white everything, black and white cookies, black and white drapes. You know, she's so interested in that. And not only is it the rhythm, but also the characters that Jarmusch writes, that he does have a sort of ability to create this sort of warmness and empathy in a lot of his characters, that all of his friends and including his wife care for him very much, and that's communicated to the audience very clearly, that even though a lot of their sort of maybe conversations, like putting people on the wall of the local bar, are mundane, and maybe he's had them before, we're not hearing them, we're hearing them for the first time. We haven't heard them before. So there is a sense of sort of interest and intrigue, while also still being sort of simple and relatable. And I think he actually does create a sort of universality through his specificity, that he's able to allow us to understand sort of a bigger, let all of us can understand this experience by being so specific, by being in sort of traditional routine and hearing a conversation that maybe we've heard before, even though it may seem very specific within the constructs of the movie. It's not larger themes of life and death and love, but with that specificity achieves a sort of universality. And I think that's communicated through a lot of the sort of side characters that Paterson interacts with every day. So in a way, Jarmusch is able to create this really calming, repetitive, but hypnotic in a way, kind of a rhythmic film that mirrors the poetry that Adam Driver reads out loud in almost ASMR-esque fashion. It's an incredibly comforting movie. The characters have a lot of relatability, but also sort of compassion and caring to them, which makes them really sort of lovable. And I think that it's a movie that you think, oh, it's just a bus driver, but it's much more than that. It is trying to sort of find the simplicity in life and really celebrate it and love that. And so if you want a movie with sort of great characters that's sort of calm and comforting, check out Paterson. Then my number 3 pick is going to be Pain and Gain.
I gotta get a pump.
That's it. It's good. It hurts. I know it does. That's it. Get it.
A movie that I actually have already covered on my limited podcast series, Connor the Contrarian, a short-lived podcast series where I talked about some of my movies that I really enjoyed that the critics or the audience didn't, and I try to think, give them a second look. And Pain and Gain was one of my very first episodes because I love the movie despite it having a mixed critical reception. Now, so if you want sort of a more breakdown episode, and similar to a lot of these series, if you've been enjoying this list in particular, check out Connor the Contrarian, where this pick and my next number 2 pick has also been talked about. But Pain and Gain is a movie that I think has an intense fan base, and an intense sort of passionate one at that. But for some reason, it didn't make a lot of money at the box office. It did make a lot of money, but Michael Bay standards, it didn't make a lot. And I think that it's also a movie that has a mixed critical response because it's Michael Bay. I think maybe just it made the list ultimately because the general reception to Michael Bay as a filmmaker by critics, I think influenced largely the general public, is that he is a hack, that he makes terrible movies, and that every movie he makes is the worst kind of the art form. And I'm a huge Michael Bay fan, so I take a large umbrage to that. And I think in particular, a movie like Pain and Gain works so well to his visual sensibilities. And for someone who is just a complete auteur in every sense of the word, one of the very few filmmakers who is working on big, large-scale budgets and gets the amount of creative control that Michael Bay does, he should be celebrated just as a visual stylist alone, because no one can do what he does. And I think with Pain and Gain, marrying that with a great script by Marcus and McFeely, he's able to actually create a really great movie with interesting themes that sort of coalesce on a lot of his beliefs as a filmmaker. Now, the movie isn't necessarily a traditional Michael Bay fan. It's got all of his trademarks and his style, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's cost $100 million. That actually, this is a movie that was made for less, adjusted for inflation, than his very first movie, Bad Boys, that he's coming off one of his biggest movies, one of the biggest movies of the decade, Transformers Dark of the Moon, and still has to make a movie for less than his very first movie. But he gets a couple of great stars in The Rock and Mark Wahlberg. I'm sure they were paid for scale, and makes a really terrific movie that actually looks more than what it is. And in terms of, that's what he's been doing since his day one, has been making movies that look more expensive than they actually are. And it's a pretty contained story about these 3 gym rats who kidnap a wealthy local businessman in an attempt to extort his money. The movie is set in Miami, and it is stylish in terms of its colors. It's glossy, it's shiny. The people look like they're sort of the most beautiful people on the world. The one word I would describe it is slick. Michael Bay has that sort of glossy kind of a visual style in terms of low angles and how he moves the camera and that sort of glimmer that's on the screen. And I think Miami, which of course he did in Bad Boys 1 and 2, is the perfect location for him. And this is amped to the total nth degree with terrific color grading and sort of a, not dreamlike in terms of maybe people think dreamlike soft edges, because this doesn't really have that, but dreamlike in the way that's idealized. It feels hot, it feels sort of fancy and bright and colorful. And I think the main character, Daniel Lugo, played by Mark Wahlberg, sees this place in Miami as a sort of Garden of Eden, that this is all these beautiful people with all the success and big houses and fancy cars, and he wants that. But the way he does it is by trying to cheat his way to the top, and I think the movie has a sort of satirical and sort of condemnation for that sort of route. or that that's sort of the cost of the American dream, which is a common theme throughout many American movies, but I think rarely actually seen through this lens and through this actual viewpoint that Michael Bay has put it through, that the gym rat, the sort of gym bro we haven't seen too often. And while they're sort of successful at the beginning, it doesn't really go well in the later half of the movie when he teams up with his partners in crime, The Rock and Anthony Mackie are both really terrific in the movie. And it's a very dark comedy, which we really haven't seen with Michael Bay since, I think, some parts in Bad Boys, that his viewpoints of these sort of guys are that they're fools and he doesn't care for them. That in something like Everybody Wants Them, Richard Linklater is so great at creating characters you want to hang out with. And I think Richard Linklater actually really likes his characters and wants you to like them too. But with Pain and Gain, it's very much almost a cold, distant kind of a relationship with them. That because they're so stupid, because they make so many bad choices, and because it's based on a true story, we want to laugh at them in a sort of dark way in terms of drugs and violence and sex, and this is an extreme situation and they won't back away from the violence, but there is a sort of absurdity to the whole situation and a sort of condemnation or condemning of the characters by Michael Bay, by the directors, that there's such a despise against the characters that in a way you can't help but laugh. So as a comedy, I think it's just terrifically funny and a great story because of that. And then with Michael Bay, his sensibilities to make this sort of Garden of Eden kind of a sensibility through Miami by making it so glorious and glossy and sort of fancy, that you understand the appeal, but you also understand the sort of allure and the fakeness of it all, that it feels like a plastic town, that maybe the guys who get to the top are like more successful versions of Daniel Lugo who cheat their way to the top and bury everyone underneath, shown by the guy who they kidnapped, Tony Shalhoub, who, even though he's being kidnapped and the successful businessman who's quote-unquote made it, Michael Bay doesn't give him any passes either because he is a kind of a bad guy as well. So there is a sort of a large satirical element of the cost of the American dream, and the people maybe that are just attracted to Miami as a place, or just this gym bro kind of a guy that tries to get to the top and, that forgets all about all the details and what can go wrong in the scenario and power and desire and where that leads. I think it's an immensely funny movie that uses Michael Bay's sensibilities and vision and perspective as a director to make a really very funny movie, a very sort of a poignant movie. I think probably the best movie Michael Bay has ever made, in my opinion. So definitely check out Pain and Gain if you haven't, and check out Michael Bay's movies because he is worth your respect. Then my number 2 pick is going to be Spring Breakers.
I got my dark tannin oil. Lay out by the pool.
This is the American dream, y'all. Spring break.
Y'all want to die tonight?
Spring break.
Get down! I'm scared, aren't you?
Spring break forever.
Spring break forever, bitches.
This is a movie I absolutely love, but I was a little bit unsure if I should put it on the list because it has sort of gained a bit of a critical appreciation later on in the decade. But ultimately, it's here because I think the general public's appreciation of it is just totally in the dumps, and I think its general sort of box office and sort of critical public reception is really poor. Now, outside of the critical community, I don't think people really get this movie, and they were maybe sold one bill of goods and got something else and weren't happy because of that. But I think, and just putting it out there, that I think Spring Breakers is definitely worth the second look. I definitely think you should go back and rewatch it because it's a movie that I've seen many times, and every time I watch it, I learn more about what I think the movie's trying to say, and some of the themes that I think done in the way that Harmony Korine actually does it is really terrific. About these 4 girls who go to Florida to go on a spring break, but then as the longer they stay, the more of the realities of the seedy underbellies of that area start to come out and come into the forefront, and that allure some people and then put some people away and leads them down to sort of a dangerous path. I talked about James Franco's role as Alien in my top 10 performances video, and I think that's an incredible performance and a large reason why the movie succeeds. So if you want to check out a little bit more about my thoughts of James Franco, check that out. But he's an alluring presence, a unique guy that you can't stop watching, and a real, I think, communicator of the themes of the movie, which I sort of interpreted to be once the party sort of leaves, once the sort of great party scenes happen. We get sort of more of the criminal elements, the ideas of murder, of race, similar to Pain and Gain in the sense of, you know, what has been attracted to us is that the reality and some of the consequences of that whether it be in our pop culture or our music videos, that we have been sold this bill of goods of gangster rap and violence in our movies that sort of just conditioned to see that way. And Spring Break is like this part where all these privileged people go and try to live out some of their fantasies and then leave and go away. But the people that sort of are running this and sort of the criminal elements of the drugs and some of the sex trafficking and whatnot sort of stay, and we get to stay with them. That the first half is, you know, a lot of the Disney stars in bikinis kind of dancing, and that was what you were sold, and I think that's what a lot of people are expecting, and you do get some of that, but the movie really succeeds in the second half when the sort of morals and the ethics become a little bit more hazy, and it becomes sort of a haze of debauchery that turns into a haze of criminality and sort of leads down this road. And I think that through the structure, it's not linear, it's not this traditional story, that there is a sort of what Harmony Korine calls a liquid narrative in the sense that it's non-linear, it's Terrence Malick-esque, it's kind of these snapshots of experiences, that there'll be flashbacks and then flash forwards and sort of everything intertwines in the timeline to get, rather than a traditional linear story that you're following along, then it's rather just an experience that we get these little snapshots of robbing a place, robbing a diner just to get the money to go to someplace, and then, you know, running away from the cops, or, you know, going back to where they were at the beginning to, you know, immediately contrasting to where they are now. It is this sort of back and forth narrative that is constantly sort of showing us where they were and then how they got to where they are, and the sort of contrast of what they're actually doing and then what they actually were at the beginning. At the beginning they were just partying, and then you go back to the next scene and they're doing something much more extreme in terms of how they got there. And I think as it goes along, we still get more of the more eerie elements start to creep up, and the world without consequences, this idea that you can party and have a great time and not worry about anything, now starts to rear its head with sort of police and with some of the criminal elements that they sort of fall into, and the group of people that they ultimately end up with, whether it be sort of their own versions of a performance, of self-parody in a way, I think, with Alien, that he's all about the show and being a persona rather than a person. I think that the movie is much similar to Pain and Gain, actually, but much more critical of the way to get to the American dream, and that what we've been sold as success, we have to sort of sacrifice a lot, and that this is actually the best test of college kids, because it's putting them into the real world of what's going on behind everything. But that can be sort of a large interpretation of it. I think in a way it's just visually stunning with its pop neon visuals, but I think the more you rewatch it and the more you really try to analyze the movie, it's particularly sort of the sort of pop songs that are used, or the montages that are used that sort of detach us with the duality of the two, you really understand some of the elements that it's trying to put out, that it's critical of this way to get to the American dream, or to define success, or what we've been told as success, or what we've been consumed so much we don't really see what the truth is that's lying underneath, and the criticism of that. And all communicated without dialogue, that there isn't a speech complaining that is explaining this, that it's all explained through actions and through visuals and through that sort of rhythmic kind of editing that it feels like, you know, a music video, but with the extremes, because it's a music video that never ends. And I don't think it's tiring. I think that it's more revelatory as the movie goes along, and does change, does keep up that pace. The four girls are terrific, and so is James Franco. It's a movie that I think you should really check out again, because I know a lot of people have seen it, but maybe with that second time, maybe with a little bit more of a critical view. Maybe read other sort of analysis that's going on about Spring Breakers, or even check out my Connor the Contrarian video, where I really break down every scene and some of the themes. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. But that's about it, guys, for this episode. Stay tuned to next week, where I give my pick of my #1 most overlooked / underappreciated movie of the decade, where it's a whole video where I talk about just that movie. And then once again, the following week, I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite international movies. So subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.